Okay, so thanks for coming back to Dreams of the High Frontier. In the last installment, we saw the failure of the Vanguard mission, and we saw the successful launch of Explorer 1. In this installment, we will meet Yuri Gagarin, and we will see the launch of Vostok 1, the first manned space mission. Chapter 4, 1958. With the successful launch of Explorer 1, the Americans had finally gotten into the space race. The Explorer 1 mission lasted for 111 days and relayed much valuable scientific data. Explorer 1 carried a number of experiments, including temperature sensors, a Geiger-Müller tube designed to detect cosmic rays in space, and experiments designed to detect micrometeor impacts. Of considerable surprise to the scientists and the mission controllers was the behavior of the spacecraft itself. Explorer 1 had been designed to rotate around its longitudinal axis. It had been thought that this would minimize the forces of inertia acting on the spacecraft. To the surprise of the scientists, Explorer 1 immediately began to turn end over end. This was the result of previously unconsidered inertial forces acting on the spacecraft and led to the rediscovery of the mathematical theories of the Swiss mathematician Leonhard Euler, whose work had been forgotten for over 200 years. Through this rediscovery, it was learned that the Explorer 1 spacecraft behaved the way it did because all spinning bodies in space spin in the direction that minimizes the kinetic forces of rapid rotation. Explorer 1 was the first in a long line of unmanned exploratory spacecraft that continues to this day. Explorer 1 re-entered the atmosphere and burned up during re-entry on March 31, 1970. At the same time, the signing of the National Air and Space Act led to the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Often referred to simply as NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration absorbed its predecessor, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, or NACA, along with its 8,000 employees, testing facilities intact. NASA's purpose was to explore the universe in peace and to develop space for the benefit of all mankind. This stood in sharp contrast to the Soviet space program, which was overseen by the Russian Air Force and existed mainly for military and propaganda purposes. Luostari Pechenga Air Base, Murmansk, USSR, January 1959. The sleek MiG-15 fighter jet touched down and rolled to a stop at the end of the runway. The aircraft had barely come to a stop in front of the hangar before the ground crew rushed up to begin servicing the jet. Yuri Gagarin was just popping the canopy when an official-looking car pulled up. It stopped 10 feet away. The driver got out, walked around the front of the car, and opened the back door. Interesting, thought Gagarin. I wonder what this is about. Maybe they've mistaken me for somebody else. Gagarin unbuckled his safety harness and climbed out of the airplane. He walked across the snowy tarmac to the man waiting next to the car. The insignia on the man's epaulets indicated that he was a sergeant of aviation. Gagarin saluted. Comrade Senior Lieutenant Gagarin? Yes. I am Sergeant Ivanova. Please get in, sir. I have orders to take you to the base commandant's office. What is this about? Asked Gagarin. Have I done something wrong? I don't know, sir. I am only following orders. Very well. Gagarin got in and shut the door. Take me to the base commandant. The drive from the airfield to the base's administrative center wasn't very long, only about 15 minutes. They pulled up in front of a large brick building and got out. Sergeant Ivanova escorted Gagarin inside and took him up to the third floor to a wood-paneled waiting room. Wait here, said Ivanova. I will tell the general that you are here to see him. He went through a door and returned a few seconds later. Gagarin opened the door and found himself in a large and comfortably appointed office. He walked across the room to stand in front of a large desk. He saluted. General Tolsky. Senior Lieutenant Gagarin reporting as ordered. General Tolsky returned Gagarin's salute. He gestured to the chairs on the other side of the desk. Comrade Gagarin, please sit. Gagarin sat down. Either you have very powerful friends or you have offended somebody very important. Gagarin was confused. I don't know what you mean, General. "Then I will tell you," said General Tulsky. He handed Gagarin a sealed envelope. "I received a personal phone call yesterday from Admiral Chebanenko. It seems that special instructions have been prepared for you. There is an aircraft waiting to take you to Moscow. You are to be on it in 4 hours. You are to open your orders in flight. That is all." Gagarin stood up. "Understood, sir." He saluted again. "Dismissed." Special Design Bureau Number 1, Moscow, USSR. Yuri Gagarin entered the nondescript-looking building and walked up to the receptionist. "Excuse me," he said. "I am looking for room 264. Go up the stairs, go left, and it will be the third door on your right." "Thank you," said Gagarin. Gagarin had read his orders yesterday on the flight from Murmansk. He hadn't understood them, and he still hadn't understood them when he had read them again this morning. All they had said was go to Special Design Bureau Number 1 first thing in the morning and present himself at room 264. Gagarin didn't understand his orders, but he didn't have to. All he had to do was show up. Gagarin stopped in front of the door to room 264 and knocked. A voice said, "Come in." Gagarin opened the door and stepped inside. The office was small and cluttered. The walls were tacked up with blueprints. More blueprints and schematics were rolled up in the corners. Technical manuals were scattered haphazardly around the floor. Clustered around the desk in the middle of the room were 3 people. The man in the middle stood up and stretched out his hand. "Comrade Gagarin, welcome. I imagine that you are wondering why you have been sent to us." "Yes, comrade," answered Gagarin. "My instructions were very vague." "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Sergei Korolev. This is my deputy, Vasily Mishin, and my chief designer, Valentin Glushko." Sergei Korolev. The name jogged a memory. "I know your work, Comrade Korolev," said Gagarin. "I read your book, Rocket Flight in Stratosphere." "Did you?" asked Korolev modestly. "Well then, it seems that my reputation has preceded me." "Yes," responded Gagarin. "I have always had an interest in astronomy." "Comrades," interjected Glushko, "before we continue, I feel that we should remind Comrade Gagarin that Comrade's association with Soviet rocket research is a state secret, and his name is not to be spoken aloud or in public or to be written down. Do you understand, comrade?" "Yes, I understand, comrades," responded Gagarin. "Excellent," said Mishin. "To business." Korolev picked up a folder off the desk and glanced through it. "The truth is, we know much about you, Lieutenant Gagarin. We know of your lifelong interest in astronomy and outer space. We know that you are an avid sportsman, that you play ice hockey, and that you have coached basketball. We know that you are an excellent pilot and highly observant." Gagarin was confused. "So you have read my service record? Why exactly have you summoned me to this meeting?" "We are assembling a list of uniquely qualified pilots, and we feel that you fit the bill." "For what?" asked Gagarin. "To be the first human being to fly in space," said Korolev. "Understand, Comrade Gagarin," said Glushko. "The training will be grueling and difficult, and the missions will be dangerous. But we are offering you something historic. Will you accept?" "Yes," said Gagarin at once. "Very well," said Korolev. "For now you will return to Murmansk. In a few weeks you will receive your new assignment. Welcome to the Soviet space program." Chapter 5, 1960. The training was indeed grueling, as Korolev had indicated it might be. Yuri Gagarin was one of 20 pilots selected for the Vostok program. In addition to tests of his piloting abilities, there were mental tests, tests of his ability to concentrate, and a seemingly endless battery of medical tests. There were sessions in centrifuges, classes in astronomy, classes in orbital mechanics. There was survival training. There were classes in mechanical and electrical engineering. There was flight training and microgravity simulations, spacecraft system briefings and spacecraft simulations. There was strenuous physical exercise and yet more medical tests. As the training progressed, it became somewhat impractical to train all 20 mission candidates at the same time. The 6 most promising pilots, including Gagarin, were given additional training in order to prepare them for the first flight of the Vostok program. As a result, they became known as the Vanguard 6. As the date of the launch grew closer, Korolev brought all the candidates together for a special meeting. "You have trained very hard," said Korolev, "and your test results have been uniformly excellent. If given the opportunity, I believe that you could all fly the mission flawlessly. However, only one of you will have the opportunity to fly first. It would be easy for us to simply point at one of you, but in the interest of fairness we value your input. We would like you to write down the name of the person other than yourself who you feel is most qualified to make the first Vostok flight." 10 minutes later, Korolev and Mission examined the 20 slips of paper that the candidates had cast their votes on. "Extraordinary," said Mission. "Indeed," responded Korolev, slightly amazed. 17 votes for Gagarin." "Yes," said Mission. "His test scores are excellent, and his preparation for the field exercises have been absolutely meticulous." "Yes," agreed Mission. "I think that the choice has been made for us." "I agree," said Korolev. Baikonur Cosmodrome, Site 15, Kazakhstan, USSR, April 12, 1961, 3 a.m. The cosmonauts' quarters were dark. The only light in the room was that little bit that spilled in under the door from the common area as the light clicked on. The door opened quietly as the base doctor walked into the room. He leaned over the bed and gently shook Yuri Gagarin awake. Gagarin blinked sleepily. "It is time." An hour later, Gagarin was sitting in the back of a van, dressed in his spacesuit. Nobody said anything. The quiet tension was cut only by the hum of the portable cooling unit attached to Gagarin's suit. It was still dark outside, but over the driver's shoulder, Gagarin could see the Vostok rocket suspended vertically in its launch cradle, hanging in midair over the flame trench. It gleamed in the harsh glare of the floodlights, surrounded by clouds of vapor that evaporated in the still morning air. The van pulled up at the base of the rocket. Gagarin got out and paused for a moment, allowing his eye to wander over the rocket's sleek lines. Then he turned and walked to the elevator waiting at the base of the gantry. As he rode up the gantry to the White Room, he could hear all manner of sounds around him, from the hissing of liquid oxygen, to the rattling of frozen pipes, to the incessant whoosh of overpressure valves venting excess air pressure out of the fuel tanks. To Gagarin, all the hissing and cracking and rattling by the Vostok rocket made it seem as though it was a living thing. The elevator came to a stop and Gagarin got out, stepping onto a long catwalk that connected the elevator to the White Room where he would enter the spacecraft. He took a couple of steps and paused on the catwalk, looking over the edge. The rocket fell away beneath him. Its conical strap-on boosters flared out far below his feet at the bottom of the gantry. Gagarin must have looked nervous because German Titov, who had ridden up the elevator with him, took Gagarin's arm and said, "Relax, Yuri. Everything will be fine." Gagarin nodded, turned, and walked to the far end of the catwalk. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The White Room gleamed brightly under the glow of fluorescent lights. It was totally bare and spotlessly clean. Inside the door, 3 pad technicians were waiting for Gagarin. They unplugged his portable cooling unit and took the rubber overshoes off of his spacesuit boots. He walked across the room, knelt down, and climbed through the spacecraft hatch. The Vostok spacecraft was very cramped on the inside, with only 2.3 meters of space. Much of the spacecraft's internal volume was taken up with the navigation and attitude control equipment, communications and diagnostic systems, and the life support system. Gagarin settled into his seat as the technicians plugged his spacesuit into the spacecraft's life support system. He keyed his helmet mic. "Control, this is Vostok 1. Com check. How do you read?" "Roger, Vostok 1. Com check confirmed. We read you loud and clear." "Understood, Control." "Control to pad leader. You are clear for hatch closure." "Roger, Control." Above and behind him, Gagarin could hear the pad technicians lowering the spacecraft hatch into place. There was a scraping sound, then a thunk, and the sound of ratchets turning as the heavy hatch was bolted into place. Next there came more muffled noises as the outer shell was moved into position and secured. "Control, this is Vostok 1. Commencing pre-launch checklist." "Roger, Vostok 1. Gagarin spent most of the next hour running through the long pre-flight checklist and bringing the spacecraft systems online one by one. "Cryosystem chill-down sequence complete." "Roger." "Switching guidance computer to primary power bus." "Confirmed." "Spacecraft's internal power is at 100%. "Copy that. Life support is at 100%. "Confirmed." In the background, Gagarin could hear a faint rumbling noise as rocket fuel began to flow from the tanks into the fuel manifolds. He shut and locked his visor. In his ear, Gagarin heard 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then he heard a muffled roar, and the spacecraft began to vibrate. The timer on the instrument panel began to tick. At 3 seconds after ignition, the engines throttled up to full power, and the lockdown clamps released the rocket. At the same moment, he heard Korolev's voice in his ear. Preliminary stages, go. Intermediate stages, go. Main stages, go. Liftoff. Have a good flight. Everything is all right. Roger, Control, said Gagarin. Let's ride. Gagarin found it difficult to breathe. It was as though an elephant was standing on his chest. At the same time, he could feel the rocket rising off the pad. It was like moving upward in a very fast elevator, but considerably more violent. The rocket vibrated from the power of its engines. It wobbled this way and that as it was caught in gusts of wind and air currents. The ride was so uneven that at times Gagarin found it difficult to call out instrument readings. Approximately 2 minutes after liftoff, there was a loud thud and a violent jolt as the 4 conical strap-on boosters expended the last of their fuel and were jettisoned. A minute after that, Gagarin heard more muffled thuds, then the whoosh of retro-rockets as the escape tower and the aerodynamic nose cone covering the spherical spacecraft were jettisoned. Bright sunlight streamed into the cockpit through the window at Gagarin's feet. "Tower jettison confirmed," he called out. "Confirmed. Tower away." The ride was much smoother now. The rocket was above most of the atmosphere. Through his window, Gagarin could see the Earth falling rapidly away. The Baikonur Cosmodrome was a tiny speck, shrinking rapidly in the distance. All the nerves and tension that Gagarin had felt before the launch were gone. He looked in wonder as the world spread itself below him. He was passing over the forests of central Russia. The trees seemed to blur together. From this altitude they looked like the piles in a carpet. The spacecraft continued to climb, now nearly silently. There was another thud, this one more heard than felt, as the core stage of the Vostok rocket was jettisoned and fell away. "Control, this is Vostok 1. Please come in. We read you, Vostok 1. What is your status?" "Control, the flight is continuing well. I can see the Earth. The visibility is good. I can see almost everything. There is a certain amount of space under the cumulus cloud cover. I am continuing the flight. Everything is good." A minute or two later, Gagarin began to pass over Siberia. He radioed the ground again. "Everything is working well. All systems are working. Let's keep going." "Roger that, Vostok 1. There was more static this time, as Gagarin moved farther and farther downrange. "Control? Control? I can't hear you very well. I feel fine. I am in good spirits. I am continuing the flight." "Cap. At. Stock." The transmission was very garbled, and then there was nothing but the soft hiss of static in Gagarin's ear. On the ground, Korolev paced nervously. "What happened?" he snapped. "We have lost contact," said Titov, who was acting as the capsule communicator, or Capcom. "He is moving very quickly. We will have to wait until he passes over Khabarovsk." In space, the third stage of the Vostok rocket expended the last of its fuel and fell away to burn up in the atmosphere. Short of its booster rocket, the Vostok spacecraft glided silently into orbit over Siberia. Gagarin keyed his mic and spoke into the onboard voice recorder. "The craft is operating normally. I can see Earth in the viewport. Everything is proceeding as planned." Below him, even at this altitude, Siberia seemed endless, stretching away in all directions. He soared over the endless Russian wilderness where time seemed to have stood still. There were no visible signs of civilization, just endless forests, trackless steppes, and winding rivers. What Gagarin later recalled most vividly was not the expansive view of the Earth. It was the colors. The rivers were dark blue. The lakes were the cover of sapphires. The steppes were a dusty brown. The fields were a verdant green. The apparently smooth surface was broken by rearing mountains and dotted with puffy white clouds. Vostok 1 continued on, passing over the Sea of Okhotsk and the long finger of the Kamchatka Peninsula. Far below, the volcanoes of Kamchatka poked up through the clouds, smoking ominously. Gagarin keyed his mic again. "The lights are on the descent monitor," he said. "I'm feeling fine. I am in good spirits. Cockpit parameters. Pressure 1, humidity 65, temperature 20, compartment pressure 1, first automatic 155, second automatic 155, retro rocket pressure 320 atmospheres." Gagarin's recitation of his instrument readings was interrupted by a burst of static in his ear. "Khabarovsk, or Vostok 1, this is Khabarovsk. Do you read?" "I hear you, Khabarovsk," said answered Gagarin. "What can you tell me about the flight? What can you tell me?" Gagarin was hoping that the flight controllers could give him specifics on the inclination of his orbit. There was a minute or two of silence that began to carry Gagarin out over the coast, but they must have read his mind because they said, "We do not have that data yet, but by our estimation, you have only been in orbit for 6 minutes. However, telemetry downlinks indicate that the spacecraft is performing well. There are no instructions from number 20. Gagarin knew they meant Korolev. "The flight is proceeding normally." Gagarin waited a few minutes, then tried contacting the ground again. "I feel splendid. Very well, very well, very well. Give me some results on this flight." But he was almost out of range, and he knew that his transmissions were beginning to break up. He heard a garbled response in his ear, but couldn't make any sense of it. He tried again. "I feel very good. Give me your data on the flight." All Gagarin got in return was static. It was too late. He had passed out of voice range. He switched to the high-gain antenna. He crossed over the Siberian coast into night over the North Pacific Ocean. He could see the lights of ships on the open ocean. He passed over Hawaii. The lights of Honolulu and Pearl Harbor were like bright jewels in the darkness. To the north, a storm swirled silently, its presence betrayed by sullen flashes of lightning. A burst of dots and dashes chattered in his ear. Khabarovsk was sending him a message via telegraph. "KK. Report the monitoring of commands." Gagarin crossed the equator at 170 degrees west latitude. He was traveling southeast over the South Pacific. He began to send back a message of his own. "I am transmitting the regular message report. 9 hours 48 minutes Moscow time," he began. "The flight is proceeding successfully. Sputnik 1 is operating normally. The mobile index of the descent monitor is moving. Pressure in the cockpit is 1, humidity 65, temperature 20, pressure in the compartment 1.2. Manual 150, first automatic 155, second automatic 155, retro-rocket system tanks 320 atmospheres. I feel fine." Gagarin pushed a button on his control panel, activating the attitude control system. The proper functioning of the attitude control system was vital for the deorbit burn. Otherwise, Gagarin ran the risk of re-entering at the wrong angle. If he was too steep, he would burn up in the atmosphere. If he was too shallow, he would skip off the top of the atmosphere and head out into open space. The dots and dashes chattered in Gagarin's ear. Khabarovsk was sending him another message. "By order of number 33, General Nikolai Kamenin, the head of the cosmonaut training program, the transmitters have been turned on, and we are transmitting this. The flight is proceeding, and the orbit is as calculated." "Understood, Khabarovsk." Gagarin sent back. "I am continuing. I am over America. I transmitted the telegraph signal on." Gagarin flew on into the night over the South Pacific. He saw the lights of Auckland and Wellington and more ships. He passed over the coast of Chile and rounded the tip of South America, crossing over the Straits of Magellan. At the tip of South America, he saw the southernmost tip of South America and the northern tip of Antarctica reaching towards each other, but they were 1,000 miles short. From his perspective high above, it looked to Gagarin as though he could step with ease from one to the other. Gagarin tried to send another status update to the ground, but he was out of range of Khabarovsk, even on the high-frequency antenna. As Gagarin flew over the South Atlantic, the sun came up. It was as sudden as flipping on a light switch. 1 second, Gagarin was on the night side of the world. Then he crossed the terminator, which was as clear and precise as if it had been drawn with a ruler, and he was in full daylight. He crossed over the stormy waters of the South Atlantic. As he was approaching the coast of Africa, Gagarin felt the hand on his chest again, and he heard a series of staccato thuds as the retro-rockets fired in anticipation of re-entry. There was a loud bang as the service module was jettisoned. Something must have malfunctioned, though, because Gagarin's view began to shift. He didn't realize it, but the service module was still connected to the re-entry module by a single bundle of wires. On the ground, Titov was listening intently. "We are receiving another message," he said. A telegraph message was coming in over the air-to-ground loop. "I read you well. The flight is going. We have lost contact again," he said. As he flew over Africa, Gagarin began to notice the increasingly heavy pressure on his chest. He also felt a sinking feeling in his stomach, as though he were falling in a very fast elevator. He looked at the altitude indicator. The needle was moving smoothly backwards around the dial. Gagarin's altitude was dropping steadily. He next looked at the G-force indicator. The needle was moving slowly upward. It was currently hovering at just below 1 g. As the descent continued, the leading edge of Gagarin's heat shield bit into the atmosphere. The spacecraft rocked back and forth, buffeted by the increasingly dense atmosphere. There was a loud series of bangs as the still attached service module rocked back and forth, buffeted by the drag of re-entry. Then the bundle of wires gave way, and the service module went tumbling away. Relieved of the dead weight, the spacecraft leapt upward. It also began to gyrate wildly, tumbling end over end. As the g-forces increased, Gagarin was pressed further and further into his seat. He couldn't move. He felt like he weighed 1,000 pounds. It was as though an elephant was standing on his chest. He tried to send another message to the ground that everything was okay, but the spacecraft was surrounded by a superheated ball of ionized plasma, created by its own descent through the atmosphere. He tried reading the g-force indicator, but with all the turbulence and the spacecraft's wild gyrations, it was very difficult. He thought that the gauge was peaking somewhere between 8 and 10 Gs. Gagarin's eyes, which were practically the only part of his body that he could move, flicked to the altitude indicator. The needle was spinning very quickly. He was dropping like a rock. At 23,000 feet, the hatch blew open with a bang. With difficulty, Gagarin unbuckled his safety harness. He pried himself out of his seat, crouched in the hatch combing. He counted to 5 and jumped. He heard the wind whistling around him. Then he felt the sharp tug of his parachute deploying. Gagarin felt himself being jerked upward by his parachute, while the spacecraft went whistling past him, still falling. At 8,200 feet, the spacecraft's main chute opened with a loud snap. It slowed the spacecraft's descent somewhat, but not much. When the spacecraft finally hit the ground, it did so with a deep-throated boom and a billowing cloud of dust. It bounced high in the air, then came down, bounced again, and rolled to a stop. Okay, so that includes this installment of Dreams of the High Frontier. Thank you for listening. You can follow me on Facebook. You can comment below if you have any comments or questions. You can follow along on my blog, which I will include a link to below. And please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.